March 15th, 1814, late afternoon, and the sky above Hertfordshire hung low and heavy with the promise of rain, the kind of grey that seemed to seep into the bones and settle there like an unwelcome guest. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the crossroads where the public coach had deposited her, her small leather travelling case clutched in fingers that had grown rough and reddened over the past 6 months, hands that had once known nothing harsher than embroidery silk and pianoforte keys. She was 24 years old, daughter of a baron who had died in debtor's prison while she held vigil outside the gates, unable to afford even the bribe that might have granted her a final farewell. Now she carried everything she owned in that single case, wore her mother's pearl earrings because they were too precious to sell and too small to fetch a meaningful price, and beneath the faded blue travelling dress that had once been her finest, her body harboured a secret that would destroy whatever fragments of reputation she had left. 10 weeks, perhaps 11, since the night Marcus Thornhill had whispered promises of marriage against her hair, since she had believed him because she had wanted so desperately to believe that someone might save her from the slow drowning of her circumstances. He had been handsome and ardent and full of plans for their future, right up until the moment he discovered that Baron Ashworth's daughter came with debts rather than dowry, and then he had vanished like morning mist, leaving her with nothing but a growing awareness that her courses had not come and would not come. She had learned of his death from a discarded newspaper, 2 months past now, killed in a duel by a man whose name sent whispers through every drawing-room in England. Frederick Sinclair, Duke of Ravenscroft, a man spoken of in terms usually reserved for forces of nature or acts of divine retribution. She had spent 3 days gathering the courage to come here, 3 days of weighing pride against survival, shame against the tiny flutter of life that had begun to make itself known beneath her heart. A child deserved more than workhouse walls and a mother's disgrace. A child deserved a chance, however slim, however purchased with humiliation. The road to Ravenscroft Hall stretched before her, lined with ancient oaks whose bare branches reached toward the darkening sky like supplicants, and Eleanor began to walk, because standing still had ceased to be an option the moment she understood what grew within her. Each step carried her closer to a man who had killed the father of her child, closer to a petition that might earn her nothing but scorn, closer to the gates of an estate that rose from the landscape like a monument to everything she had lost. The first drops of rain began to fall as those gates came into view, iron and imposing, bearing a crest she did not recognize, but would soon come to know intimately. Eleanor Ashworth, who had once danced at balls and dreamed of love, pressed her hand briefly against her still flat stomach and walked forward into the gathering storm. The gatekeeper had summoned a footman, and the footman had summoned Mrs. Fleming, and Mrs. Fleming had looked at Eleanor's soaked dress and chattering teeth with an expression that mingled suspicion with something that might have been pity, and now Eleanor stood in the grandest library she had ever seen, dripping onto a carpet that likely cost more than her father's entire estate had been worth at the end, waiting for an audience with the man who had killed Marcus Thornhill. The fire burning in the massive hearth did nothing to warm her, though she stood close enough to feel its heat against her wet skirts, and she could not stop shivering, despite her best efforts to present herself with some semblance of dignity. The storm had broken in earnest during her walk up the long drive, and she had arrived at the servants' entrance looking like a drowned creature, her careful speech about seeking employment as a governess dying on her lips when she saw the scale of this house, and understood that no housekeeper would believe a woman of her obvious breeding had come seeking such a position without darker motives. She had asked to see the Duke instead, had spoken her father's name, and something in Mrs. Fleming's eyes had shifted. Some recognition of the Ashworth name, and perhaps its recent disgrace, and the housekeeper had led her here to wait. The door opened behind her, and Eleanor turned to face Frederick Sinclair, Duke of Ravenscroft, and found that the rumors had not prepared her adequately for the reality of him. He was tall, taller than Marcus had been, with dark hair that showed premature silver at the temples, despite the fact that he could not be much past 30, and his face held the kind of cold beauty that made one think of marble statues in winter gardens, perfect and utterly without warmth. His eyes moved over her with an assessment that made her feel like a horse at auction, noting her sodden dress, her worn shoes, the work-roughened hands she tried to hide in her skirts. And when his gaze reached her face, she saw nothing there but contempt. "You have 5 minutes," he said, his voice as cold as his expression, and Eleanor understood that this was more than she had any right to expect, that he had granted even this much only because the Ashworth name had once meant something in this county. She opened her mouth to deliver the speech she had prepared, the careful explanation of her circumstances, but what came out instead was the truth stripped bare of all its protective covering. "I knew Marcus Thornhill," she said, and watched the Duke's face transform from cold indifference to something far more dangerous, a fury so controlled it seemed to lower the temperature of the room by several degrees. His hand moved to grip the back of a nearby chair, and she saw for the first time the scar that ran across his left hand, pale and old, and she knew without being told that Marcus had put it there. "Then you may leave," the Duke said, his voice gone soft in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have, and Eleanor felt her last hope crumbling to ash. Eleanor turned toward the door because there was nothing else to do, no words left that might soften the granite of his expression or penetrate the armor of his hatred for a dead man, and she had taken perhaps 3 steps when the room began to tilt sideways in a manner that had become sickeningly familiar over the past weeks, the edges of her vision going grey and soft, like wet paper dissolving in water. She reached for something to steady herself, found only empty air, and heard from a great distance the Duke's voice saying something sharp, perhaps her name, perhaps a curse, before her knees simply refused to hold her any longer, and the library's magnificent carpet rose up to meet her. She did not fully lose consciousness, not entirely, but existed for several moments in a strange twilight state, where she was aware of voices above her, of hands lifting her, of the scratch of wet wool against her cheek and the lingering scent of wood smoke, and something else, something clean and masculine, that she would later learn was simply Frederick Sinclair, though in that moment she knew nothing except that she had failed, that she had come all this way and endured all this humiliation only to collapse like some penny novel heroine at the feet of a man who wished her gone. Mrs. Fleming's voice cut through the fog, practical and commanding, saying something about the east wing and dry clothes and warming pans, and Eleanor tried to protest, tried to say that she could walk, that she needed nothing from this house or its master, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, and her limbs refused to cooperate with her intentions. She was lifted, and the sensation was so foreign after months of having no one to lean upon that she nearly wept from the simple fact of being carried, and she understood dimly that it was not the Duke who bore her, but rather some footman summoned for the purpose, though she could feel Frederick's gaze upon her like a physical weight as she was taken from the library. The last thing she saw clearly before the darkness of the hallway swallowed her was his face, and something in his expression had shifted from cold dismissal to something more complicated, something she lacked the strength to analyze, but which looked almost like the reluctant concern of a man confronting a problem he had not anticipated and did not welcome. Her wet shoes left a trail of water on the marble floors, and she thought distantly that someone would have to clean that she was causing trouble even in her departure, and then she was being settled onto a bed softer than anything she had slept upon in 6 months, and Mrs. Fleming was issuing orders about hot water and broth and her travelling case, and Eleanor tried once more to say that she should leave, that the Duke did not want her here. But the housekeeper merely pressed a weathered hand to her forehead and told her in a tone that brooked no argument that she would be going nowhere tonight, storm or no storm, Duke's wishes or otherwise, and Eleanor, who had held herself together through poverty and grief and shame, finally let her eyes close and surrendered to the simple mercy of being cared for. The morning light that filtered through the guest chamber windows was grey and soft, the storm having exhausted itself some time in the small hours, and Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth and safety, her body cocooned in sheets finer than any she had touched in months, before memory crashed over her like a wave, and she remembered where she was and how she had come to be here, and the absolute shambles she had made of everything. She pushed herself upright, fighting the familiar surge of nausea that accompanied her mornings now, and found that someone had laid out a robe beside the bed, something in dove-grey wool that clearly belonged to a woman of means, and she wrapped it around herself over the borrowed nightgown with hands that trembled slightly from hunger and residual weakness, and the knowledge of what she must do now. Mrs. Fleming appeared as if summoned by Eleanor's movement, carrying a tray with tea and plain toast and a small pot of honey, and the housekeeper's expression was carefully neutral as she informed Eleanor that His Grace wished to see her in the morning room when she felt well enough, and that there was no particular hurry, though something in the way Mrs. Fleming said this suggested that the Duke was not a man accustomed to waiting for anything or anyone. Eleanor ate what she could manage, which was not much, and allowed herself to be led through corridors that seemed endless in their grandeur, to a sunny room where Frederick Sinclair stood by the window with his back to her, his posture rigid as iron, and when he turned at her entrance, she saw that he looked as though he had not slept at all, shadows beneath his eyes and a tension in his jaw that spoke of long hours spent wrestling with something unpleasant. He dismissed Mrs. Fleming with a gesture, though Eleanor noticed the housekeeper retreated only as far as the doorway, leaving it slightly ajar in what might have been propriety or protectiveness. And then Frederick's gaze fixed upon Eleanor with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet it, knowing that she owed him the truth and that whatever came after, she would face with what remained of her dignity. "You will tell me everything," he said, and it was not a question but a command, and Eleanor found that she was too tired for the careful speech she had planned, too worn down by months of carrying this burden alone, and so she simply told him, the words spilling out in a voice that barely wavered, how Marcus Thornhill had courted her when her father was still alive, and their situation merely reduced rather than ruined, how he had spoken of marriage and of love and of a future that had seemed like salvation, how she had believed him because she had wanted so desperately to believe in something, how she had given herself to him in the garden folly of her father's mortgaged estate on a summer night that now seemed like it had happened to someone else entirely, how Marcus had discovered 3 weeks later that her father's debts were insurmountable and had vanished from her life without a word of explanation or farewell, and how she had discovered a month after that she was carrying his child, and by then her father was dead, and there was nothing left. Nothing at all. Frederick's hand gripped the back of a chair so hard his knuckles went white, and the scar across his fingers stood out like an accusation, and Eleanor waited for the disgust, for the dismissal, for the door. But instead he said in a voice she barely recognized as belonging to the cold man from the night before, "The child will have my name," and Eleanor heard the words but could not make sense of them, standing frozen in borrowed clothes in a stranger's house, while everything she thought she understood about the world rearranged itself around those 7 impossible syllables. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Eleanor heard herself say the word why, though she had not consciously decided to speak, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and thin like a thread pulled too tight. And Frederick Sinclair turned away from her then, moving toward the window where the grey morning light fell across his face and revealed for the first time something other than cold command in his features, something that looked almost like uncertainty, though she could not imagine this man uncertain about anything. He was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor felt her heart beating against her ribs like a caged thing, and she thought perhaps she had imagined those words. Perhaps the strain of the past months had finally broken something in her mind, and she was hearing things that existed only in desperate fantasy. But then he spoke again, and his voice was rough with an emotion she could not name. "Marcus Thornhill," he said, "destroyed my sister." And the name fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples through everything Eleanor thought she understood about this moment. She was 17, Frederick continued, and he courted her with the same pretty lies he told you, the same promises of forever. And when he had taken what he wanted, he spread word of her ruin through every drawing-room in London, and called it sport. And Georgiana has not left our country estate in 4 years, because she cannot bear the whispers. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. A terrible recognition of parallel suffering, and she understood now the depth of the hatred she had sensed in Frederick the night before, understood that Marcus had left a trail of destruction far wider than she had known, and she felt sick with the knowledge that she had given herself willingly to a man capable of such cruelty. "But that does not explain," she started, and Frederick turned back to face her with something blazing in his dark eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. "He discarded you," Frederick said, "as though you were nothing, as though a woman of your quality was merely refuse to be thrown aside when it no longer suited him. And every man in society will know that the child he abandoned, the woman he ruined, bears the Ravenscroft name, and will inherit the Ravenscroft fortune, and Marcus Thornhill will be remembered as the fool who threw away a duchess." Eleanor felt the words land like blows, understanding flooding through her alongside a strange and bitter disappointment, because of course this was about revenge. Of course she was merely a weapon to be wielded against a dead man, and she had been foolish to feel even a moment of something softer when he had spoken of giving her child his name. "I will not be a pawn," she said, and her voice was stronger now, steadied by the familiar ground of being unwanted for herself, and she straightened her spine despite the borrowed robe and the remnants of illness and the absolute precariousness of her position. "I have been used by one man already, and I will not compound that mistake by allowing another to use me for his vendetta, however much I might need what you are offering, and I thank you for your hospitality. But I believe it is time I left." She turned toward the door, and Frederick said, "Wait," in a voice she had not heard from him before, and when she looked back, his expression had cracked open somehow, revealing something unguarded beneath the ice, and he said more quietly that perhaps there could be conditions, an arrangement that served them both, if she would only stay long enough to hear them. The afternoon light of March 17th fell clear and cold through the tall windows of the drawing-room where Eleanor stood waiting, having spent the night and much of the morning turning Frederick's offer over in her mind like a stone whose every facet she needed to examine before she could determine its true nature, and she had come to a decision that sat heavy in her chest but steady, rooted in the knowledge that she had nothing left to bargain with except her own integrity and the terms under which she would surrender it. She was dressed now in a gown of deep green wool that Mrs. Fleming had produced from some forgotten wardrobe, explaining that it had belonged to the Dowager Duchess years ago and might be altered to fit, and though it hung slightly loose on Eleanor's frame, It was finer than anything she had worn in months, and she felt less like a beggar in it, more like a woman who might be capable of negotiating her own fate. Frederick entered without preamble, and she saw immediately that the waiting had cost him something, a tightness around his eyes and a restlessness in his movements that suggested he was unused to uncertainty of any kind. And when he looked at her, there was a question in his gaze that he would never have permitted himself to speak aloud. "I have conditions," Eleanor said before he could speak, and she watched something flicker across his face that might have been surprise or irritation, or perhaps something closer to respect. "I will accept your offer of marriage, and I will bear your name with whatever dignity I can muster. But I will not pretend emotions I do not feel or perform a devotion that does not exist. And I will have a voice in how my child is raised and educated. And I will not be hidden away like something shameful while you parade your revenge before society." Frederick was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze, knowing that if she flinched now, she would spend the rest of her life flinching. And then the corner of his mouth curved in what might almost have been a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "You have spent considerable thought on this," he said, and she answered that she had spent 24 hours with little else to occupy her mind. The door opened then, and a man entered whom Eleanor had not seen before, sandy-haired and open-faced, with the easy bearing of someone accustomed to being welcome wherever he went, and he stopped short at the sight of Eleanor with an expression of such complete bewilderment that under other circumstances she might have laughed. "Frederick," the man said slowly, "I received your message and came as quickly as I could, but I confess I understood almost none of it," and Frederick's expression shifted into something more guarded as he performed introductions. "Lord Philip Greville, meet Miss Eleanor Ashworth, who will be the Duchess of Ravenscroft in 3 days' time." Philip's reaction told Eleanor everything she needed to know about the social risk Frederick was taking, the way his face cycled through disbelief and concern and something that looked almost like fear for his friend. And she understood then that whatever revenge Frederick believed he was enacting, the cost to his own reputation would be considerable. And she filed that knowledge away as another facet of the stone she was still trying to understand. The formal dining room of Ravenscroft Hall glowed with candlelight on the evening of March chapter 18th, the flames reflected in crystal glasses and polished silver until the whole space seemed to shimmer with warmth that belied the cold spring night pressing against the windows. And Eleanor sat in a borrowed gown of burgundy silk that Mrs. Fleming had altered through the afternoon with quick, competent stitches, feeling for the first time in months like something other than a ghost haunting the edges of her own existence. Philip Greville sat across from her, his sandy hair catching the light as he leaned forward with another question that was clearly designed to test her, to find the cracks in whatever facade he believed she must be maintaining. And Eleanor met each inquiry with the calm directness she had learned in her father's library during years of education that society deemed unnecessary for a woman, but which had shaped her mind nonetheless. "You have read Hume," Philip said with evident surprise when she referenced the philosopher's thoughts on human nature, and Eleanor allowed herself a small smile as she replied that her father had believed ignorance was the only true poverty, a statement that landed with unexpected weight given her current circumstances, and she saw Frederick's hand pause on his wine glass as something shifted in his expression. The conversation turned then to questions of moral philosophy, whether duty or inclination should guide human action, and Eleanor found herself arguing with more animation than she had felt in months, her voice growing stronger as she defended the position that true virtue lay not in cold adherence to rules, but in the cultivation of genuine feeling rightly directed. And when she glanced at Frederick, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Philip asked about her situation with less delicacy than the topic warranted. inquiring how a woman of her obvious education had found herself in such reduced circumstances. And before Eleanor could frame a response that would preserve some dignity, Frederick spoke with an edge to his voice that surprised them all, saying that Miss Ashworth's circumstances were the result of others' failures, and not her own, and he would thank Philip to remember that she would shortly be his Duchess. The silence that followed was broken by Eleanor's quiet refusal of wine when the footman offered to refill her glass, a small gesture that she saw Philip note with dawning understanding. And the remainder of the meal passed in conversation that had shifted somehow, Philip's questions becoming less probing and more genuinely curious, as though he had decided to see her as a person rather than a puzzle to be solved. When dinner concluded, Frederick rose and offered Eleanor his arm to escort her to her chamber, a courtesy he had not extended before, and as they walked through the candle-lit corridors, she was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth of his arm beneath her fingertips, the way his height made her feel simultaneously small and somehow protected. At her chamber door he paused, and in the flickering light she saw something in his face that made her heart beat unevenly, and he said quietly that his mother would arrive tomorrow, and that Eleanor should prepare herself, but that she should know he would not allow anyone to make her feel unwelcome in what would be her home. And when his fingers brushed hers in parting the touch, lingered a moment longer than necessary, and Eleanor lay awake long after, pressing her hand against the place where his warmth still seemed to linger. The carriage bearing the Dowager Duchess arrived precisely at noon on March 19th, its wheels crunching against the gravel drive, with a sound that seemed to Eleanor like the drumbeat preceding an execution, and she stood in the entrance hall beside Frederick, with her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling, wearing the same deep green gown she had worn when accepting his proposal, because it was the finest thing available to her, and she needed whatever armor she could find against the judgment she knew was coming. Lady Harriet Sinclair descended from the carriage with the elegant economy of movement that spoke of decades of social authority, her silver hair perfectly arranged beneath a travelling bonnet of dark blue velvet, and her sharp eyes swept over Eleanor with an assessment so thorough that Eleanor felt as though every secret she possessed had been catalogued and found wanting before a single word was spoken. Frederick stepped forward to greet his mother with a kiss on her cheek, but Lady Harriet's attention remained fixed on Eleanor even as she accepted her son's greeting, and when she spoke her voice was cool and precise as she said that she had come the moment she received Frederick's extraordinary letter, and that she trusted there was some explanation for this madness that would make sense to a rational mind. The drawing-room became a battlefield of courtesy and interrogation as Lady Harriet seated herself in the chair nearest the fire and directed Eleanor to sit opposite her, and Frederick stood by the window with tension visible in every line of his body as his mother began her assault with questions that were phrased politely but cut like surgical instruments designed to expose weakness and deception. "You carry Lord Thornhill's child," Lady Harriet said without preamble, "and you expect my son to give it his name, and you his protection, and I wish to know what possible benefit you imagine this arrangement provides to anyone but yourself." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, but she held Lady Harriet's gaze and answered with the only currency she had left, which was truth, saying that she expected nothing and deserved nothing, and had come to Ravenscroft Hall with no hope at all, but only the desperate need to try something before she and her child were lost entirely to poverty and shame, and that if Lady Harriet wished to know her intentions, they were simply to survive and to give her child a chance at a life that was not defined by its mother's ruin. The room fell silent, and Eleanor saw something shift almost imperceptibly in Lady Harriet's expression, and then Frederick spoke from the window with a quiet ferocity that Eleanor had not heard from him before, saying that his decision was made and would not be altered, and that he would thank his mother to treat his future wife with the respect her position would demand. Lady Harriet studied her son for a long moment before returning her attention to Eleanor, and though her manner did not warm precisely, there was something less hostile in her voice when she said that she would reserve judgment and observe, and Eleanor understood that this was perhaps the best she could hope for. After Lady Harriet retired to rest from her journey, Frederick found Eleanor in the small sitting room adjacent to the drawing room, her composure finally cracking as she pressed her hand against her unsettled stomach, and he stood before her with an expression she could not quite read as he said quietly that he was sorry she had been subjected to that, and that his mother's sharpness came from years of protecting their family from those who would harm it. And when he reached out and took her trembling hand in his, the gesture was so unexpected and so gentle that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, and for just a moment she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she had not made a terrible mistake after all. The morning of March 20th dawned with a clarity that seemed almost theatrical in its perfection, spring sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of Ravenscroft Hall's private chapel and casting pools of coloured light across the ancient stone floor where generations of Sinclairs had stood to speak their vows, and Eleanor moved through the hours before the ceremony in a state of surreal calm that felt like walking through a dream from which she might wake at any moment to find herself still in that cramped boarding-house room with nothing but despair for company. Clara had arrived at dawn, her fair face flushed from travel and her freckled hands trembling as she embraced Eleanor with a fierceness that spoke of weeks of worry, and as she helped Eleanor into the cream-coloured wedding dress that Mrs. Fleming had worked through the night to complete, she whispered questions that Eleanor could barely answer, because how did one explain that she was marrying a duke she had known for 5 days, a man whose enemy had ruined her, a man who spoke of revenge but looked at her sometimes with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat? The chapel was small and intimate, holding perhaps 30 souls at capacity. But today it held only 6 as Eleanor walked toward the altar, where Frederick waited in a dark blue coat that made his grey eyes appear almost silver in the tinted light. And she saw with a start that his hands, those capable hands with the scar that marked his history with Marcus Thornhill, were not entirely steady as he reached to take hers. The vicar spoke the ancient words, and Eleanor heard them as though from a great distance, her responses coming automatically, while her attention remained fixed on Frederick's face, searching for some sign of what he truly felt beneath that composed exterior. And when they reached the vows themselves, something shifted in the air between them as his voice dropped lower and took on an intensity that had not been there before. "I, Frederick, take thee, Eleanor, to be my wedded wife," he said, and his eyes held hers with such focused attention that she felt as though they were entirely alone, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death us do part, and on the word love. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around hers, and Eleanor felt her heart stutter in her chest, because surely she had imagined that emphasis. Surely this was still merely a bargain struck between strangers. The ring he slid onto her finger was a simple gold band, warm from being held in his palm, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife. Frederick lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that lingered just a moment longer than propriety demanded, and Clara caught Eleanor's eye across the chapel with an expression of surprise that confirmed she had not imagined the tenderness in that gesture. At the wedding breakfast that followed, a modest affair in the morning room with sunlight streaming across the table, Lady Harriet observed everything with sharp eyes that had softened slightly since yesterday, and Philip Greville raised a toast to the new Duchess of Ravenscroft with genuine warmth that had not been present in his manner 3 days before, and Clara leaned close to Eleanor and whispered that Frederick watched her when she was not looking with something in his face that did not look like revenge at all, and Eleanor felt the first fragile tendril of hope begin to unfurl in her chest even as evening approached, and with it the wedding night she both anticipated and feared. The candles in the Duchess's chambers had burned low by the time Eleanor heard the soft knock at the connecting door, and her heart seized in her chest as she called out permission to enter in a voice that trembled despite her efforts to steady it, and she stood beside the bed in the white nightgown that Mrs. Fleming had laid out for her, her mother's pearl earrings removed and placed carefully on the dressing table, her hair unbound and falling past her shoulders in waves that she had brushed 100 times. While waiting for this moment, she had been dreading since Frederick first spoke of marriage. He entered in shirt-sleeves with his coat removed and his cravat loosened, and the informality of his appearance made him seem both more human and more dangerous. And Eleanor felt her hands begin to shake as memories of another night flooded through her unbidden, memories of Marcus's honeyed promises and gentle touches that had led to her ruin. And she wondered if she would ever be able to separate what had been done to her from what was expected of her now. Frederick stopped several feet from where she stood, and she watched his grey eyes move across her face, reading something there that made his expression shift from anticipation to something far more complex. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it, as he said simply that she was afraid of him. Eleanor wanted to deny it, but the words would not come, and instead she found herself nodding once, a jerky motion that felt like confession, and she braced herself for anger or disappointment or cold dismissal of her weakness. But Frederick did none of those things, instead moving to the chair beside the dying fire and lowering himself into it as though they had all the time in the world. And he gestured for her to sit on the edge of the bed, which she did with legs that threatened to give way beneath her. And then he told her something that shattered every expectation she had carried into this room. "This marriage will be real only when you wish it to be," he said, and his voice was rough with something she could not identify as he continued, explaining that he had no intention of claiming rights that would make her flinch from his touch, that whatever revenge he had imagined against Marcus's memory would be hollow indeed if it required him to become the same kind of man who had hurt her. The tears came then without warning or permission, great shuddering sobs that Eleanor could not contain, and she pressed her hands over her face in mortification, even as relief flooded through her like water breaking through a dam, and she felt the bed shift as Frederick moved from the chair to sit beside her, and then his arms came around her, and she was pressed against his chest while she wept with an abandon she had not allowed herself since the night she had first understood that Marcus would never return for her. He held her without speaking, one hand moving slowly across her back in a rhythm that soothed without demanding, and when her tears finally subsided, he lifted her chin with gentle fingers and pressed a single kiss to her forehead that burned like a brand against her skin. "Sleep well, Eleanor," he said as he rose to leave, and at the connecting door he paused to look back at her with an expression that made her breath catch. And then he was gone, and she was alone in the candle-lit room with the fire dying to embers, and something new and fragile taking root in her chest. And when she finally lay down to sleep, her hand rested on the place where he had sat, still warm from his presence. The days following the wedding night unfolded with a gentleness that Eleanor had not dared to imagine, and as late March painted the gardens of Ravenscroft Hall in the pale greens and tentative blossoms of early spring, she found herself settling into the rhythm of her new life with a cautious wonder that grew stronger with each passing sunrise, her body changing as the child within her grew past the 12-week mark and her morning sickness finally beginning to ease into something more manageable. Frederick had kept his promise with a faithfulness that continued to surprise her, appearing each morning at breakfast with questions about her health and comfort that seemed genuinely interested rather than merely dutiful. And in the evenings, they had fallen into a pattern of sitting together in the library, where he would read correspondence, while she explored the magnificent collection of books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and sometimes she would look up from her pages to find his grey eyes resting on her with an expression she could not quite decipher, but which made warmth bloom in her chest nonetheless. Clara had departed 3 days after the wedding with tearful embraces and whispered assurances that Eleanor had found something unexpected and precious in this strange arrangement, and Lady Harriet had surprised everyone by extending her stay indefinitely, claiming the London season held no interest for her this year, though Eleanor suspected she wished to observe this peculiar marriage more closely, and to Eleanor's greater surprise, the older woman had begun to thaw toward her in small but unmistakable ways. It was Lady Harriet who first suggested that Eleanor might wish to visit the village as the new Duchess, and when Eleanor had hesitated, uncertain of her welcome among people who surely knew the circumstances of this hasty marriage, Frederick had looked up from his papers and said quietly that she was his wife, and would be received as such, and the fierce certainty in his voice had made something flutter beneath her ribs that had nothing to do with the child she carried. The visit to the village had been a revelation, the shopkeepers and tenants greeting her with genuine warmth that spoke well of Frederick's character as a landlord, and when old Mrs. Pembroke at the haberdashery had pressed Eleanor's hands between her weathered palms and declared that the Duke deserved happiness after all he had endured, Eleanor had felt tears prick at her eyes because she was beginning to want that too, beginning to want to be the source of that happiness rather than merely the recipient of his protection. In the quiet moments between breakfast and dinner, between the library and her solitary walks through the awakening gardens, Eleanor found herself thinking less of the revenge that Frederick had claimed as his motivation, and more of the man himself, the way his rare smiles transformed his severe features, the patience with which he explained estate matters when she asked questions, the careful distance he maintained between them that somehow felt less like coldness now and more like respect. And she wondered when exactly she had stopped fearing him and started wishing he would close that distance, wondered when the gratitude she felt had begun to shift into something deeper and more dangerous that she was not yet brave enough to name. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the music room as Eleanor sat at the pianoforte, her fingers finding their way across keys she had not touched in nearly 2 years, and the melody that emerged was hesitant at first, rusty, from disuse, but gradually it gained strength and confidence as muscle memory awakened beneath her hands, and she lost herself in a piece her mother had taught her when she was barely tall enough to reach the pedals. She did not hear Frederick enter, did not know he stood in the doorway watching her with an expression that would have stolen her breath had she seen it, did not realize that he had followed the sound of music through the house like a man enchanted until the final notes faded, and she looked up to find him there, and the color that flooded her cheeks made him smile in a way that transformed his severe features into something approaching tenderness. "You did not tell me you played," he said as he crossed the room to stand beside the instrument, and Eleanor found herself explaining that there had been little opportunity for such frivolities in recent years, that her father had sold their pianoforte along with everything else when the debts began to mount, and she watched something shift in Frederick's grey eyes as he absorbed yet another detail of the life she had endured before arriving at his door. He asked her to play again, and she obliged, choosing a livelier piece this time, and when she finished, he told her that his sister Georgiana had once played beautifully before Marcus Thornhill had destroyed her spirit, along with her reputation, and Eleanor's hand stilled on the keys as she recognized the magnitude of what he had just shared with her. "Tell me about her," Eleanor said softly, and Frederick sat down on the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her dress, and he spoke of the sister he had failed to protect, the bright, laughing girl who had believed Marcus's lies just as Eleanor had, who had been publicly humiliated when Marcus abandoned her after compromising her at a house party, who now lived quietly in the country and refused to see anyone from their former social circle. Eleanor reached out without thinking and laid her hand over his scarred one where it rested on his knee, and Frederick looked down at their joined hands with an expression of such naked vulnerability that Eleanor felt her heart crack open along fault lines she had not known existed. "I am sorry," she whispered, meaning it for Georgiana and for him and for all the damage Marcus Thornhill had wrought in his careless cruelty, and Frederick turned his hand beneath hers so that their palms pressed together, their fingers interlacing as naturally as if they had done this 100 times before. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said, his voice rough with emotion he seemed unable to fully suppress. And they sat together in the golden afternoon light, with their hands intertwined, while something unspoken passed between them, something that felt terrifyingly like the beginning of love, though neither of them was brave enough yet to call it by its name. The first week of April brought with it a warmth that seemed to mirror the changing atmosphere within Ravenscroft Hall, and Eleanor found herself standing before the long mirror in her dressing room as the modiste from the village made final adjustments to the new wardrobe Frederick had insisted upon ordering. Gowns in soft blues and gentle greens that accommodated her gradually changing figure, with elegant draping that whispered of her condition without announcing it crudely to the world. And as she watched the woman work, Eleanor marveled at how different her reflection looked from the desperate creature who had arrived at these gates barely 3 weeks ago with nothing but a worn travelling case and a heart full of fear. Lady Harriet had taken to joining Eleanor for morning tea in the sunny parlour that overlooked the East Gardens, and their conversations had evolved from carefully polite exchanges into something approaching genuine companionship, the older woman sharing stories of Frederick as a boy that made Eleanor laugh and ache in equal measure, tales of a serious child who had shouldered responsibility too young when his father died and left him Duke at merely 19 years old. It was during one such morning that Lady Harriet first spoke directly of what Eleanor carried, reaching across to touch Eleanor's hand where it rested on her barely visible belly, and saying quietly that children were blessings regardless of how they came to be. And Eleanor had wept then, grateful tears for acceptance she had not dared to hope for from this formidable woman who had every reason to despise anything connected to Marcus Thornhill. Frederick had walked in upon this scene of feminine emotion, and frozen in the doorway with an expression of such alarmed bewilderment that both women had laughed through their tears, and something had shifted in that moment between the three of them, a sense of family forming from the most unlikely of circumstances. That evening Frederick had asked Eleanor to walk with him through the gardens after dinner, and they had strolled the gravel paths as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose, speaking of everything and nothing, while their arms brushed occasionally in a way that sent sparks through Eleanor's entire body. And when they paused beside the fountain, where stone Ains poured endless water into a marble basin, Frederick had turned to her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I find myself thinking of you constantly," he admitted in a voice rough with something that sounded almost like confusion, as though his own feelings were a puzzle he could not solve, and Eleanor had looked up at this powerful man who had claimed her child and given her his name, and felt her carefully guarded heart crack open just a little more. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing, simply stood there in the gathering dusk while the fountain sang its eternal song, and Frederick looked at her as though she were something precious and unexpected. And when he finally took her hand and lifted it to his, lips the kiss, he pressed to her fingers burned through her glove like a brand, a promise of something neither of them was quite ready to name, but which grew stronger with every passing day. The second week of April brought an invitation that made Eleanor's hands tremble as she held the heavy cream paper embossed with the Thornhill family crest, and she stood in the morning room with the letter clutched between her fingers, while her mind raced through the implications of what she was reading. For Marcus's mother, the Dowager Lady Thornhill, was hosting a spring ball and had extended an invitation to the new Duchess of Ravenscroft, with words that dripped honeyed poison beneath their formal courtesy. Frederick found her there 10 minutes later, still staring at the invitation, as though it might burst into flames if she willed it strongly enough. And when he gently took the paper from her hands and read it himself, his expression darkened into something thunderous that reminded Eleanor of the man she had first met in that library on a storm-racked evening that now seemed a lifetime ago. "They mean to humiliate you," he said flatly, and Eleanor nodded, because she understood perfectly well what this invitation represented: a chance for society to witness the confrontation between Marcus's discarded mistress and his grieving family. Entertainment dressed in silk and served with champagne for those who fed on the misfortunes of others. She expected Frederick to forbid her attendance, to shield her from this obvious trap with the same protective instincts he had shown since their wedding night, but instead he looked at her with those grey eyes that had grown so much warmer over the past weeks and asked her what she wished to do, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest at being given the choice rather than having it made for her. "I wish to attend," she heard herself say, surprising them both with the steel in her voice, "because I am tired of hiding from whispers, and I would rather face them with my head high than cower here wondering what they say behind closed doors." Frederick studied her for a long moment before a slow smile curved his lips, a smile she had never seen before that held pride and something that looked remarkably like admiration. And he told her that in that case they would need to ensure she had a gown worthy of a duchess making her first public appearance. The next 2 weeks became a whirlwind of preparations as the modiste worked through the nights to create a masterpiece in midnight blue silk that would announce Eleanor's new status without the vulgarity of excessive ornamentation, and Lady Harriet took charge of instructing Eleanor in the intricate dance of social warfare that would be required to navigate the evening ahead. Clara stayed on at Ravenscroft Hall to lend her support, spending hours helping Eleanor practice the serene expression she would need to maintain, while arrows of gossip flew around her, and in the evenings Frederick would find excuses to join them in the drawing-room, where his presence had become as necessary to Eleanor as breathing. The night before they were to depart for the Thornhill estate, Frederick came to Eleanor's sitting room after dinner and found her standing at the window staring out at the moonlit gardens with her arms wrapped around herself, and without speaking he crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her against his chest in an embrace that said everything words could not. The carriage bearing the Sinclair crest rolled through the evening darkness toward the Thornhill estate, and Eleanor sat across from Frederick, with her gloved hands folded in her lap, while her heart beat a rhythm of mingled terror and determination against her ribs, the midnight blue silk of her gown rustling softly with each sway of the vehicle as they drew closer to what she knew would be either her triumph or her complete destruction in the eyes of society. Frederick had not spoken since they departed Ravenscroft Hall, but his eyes had not left her face, and in the dim light filtering through the carriage windows, Eleanor could see something fierce and protective burning in those grey depths that had once seemed so cold to her, a silent promise that she would not face this evening alone. Lady Harriet had remained at home, declaring herself too old for such theatrical nonsense, but pressing Eleanor's hand firmly before departure and telling her to remember that she was a Sinclair now, and Sinclairs did not cower before anyone, least of all a family whose son had proven himself a coward and a scoundrel. Clara had wanted desperately to attend, but had been convinced to stay behind, and Eleanor was grateful for that small mercy, because she could not bear the thought of her gentle cousin being subjected to the cruelties that awaited within those glittering walls. When the carriage finally stopped before the blazing lights of Thornhill Manor, Frederick descended first and turned to offer Eleanor his hand, and as she placed her fingers in his palm, she felt him squeeze gently, a small gesture of reassurance that steadied her more than any words could have done. The entrance hall was crowded with guests who fell silent as the Duke of Ravenscroft entered with his new Duchess on his arm, and Eleanor felt the weight of 100 stares pressing against her skin like physical blows, whispers rising like a tide around them as they made their way toward the ballroom where the Dowager Lady Thornhill waited to receive them. She was a tall woman with iron-grey hair and Marcus's eyes, and when she turned to greet them, her smile was a knife wrapped in velvet, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to hear as she welcomed the Duchess, and expressed such surprise that she had managed to rise so far from her unfortunate circumstances. Eleanor felt Frederick stiffen beside her, but before he could respond, she lifted her chin and smiled with a serenity. She did not feel, thanking Lady Thornhill for her gracious invitation and remarking that circumstances had indeed changed remarkably since she had last had dealings with the Thornhill family, a pointed reminder delivered with such honeyed sweetness that several onlookers had to hide smiles behind their fans. Frederick led her onto the dance floor before Lady Thornhill could recover, and as the orchestra began a waltz, he pulled her closer than propriety strictly allowed, his hand warm and steady at her waist, while he murmured against her ear that she was magnificent, and that he had never been prouder to call anyone his wife. And Eleanor looked up at him with shining eyes, as something that had been frozen within her for so long finally began to thaw completely. The waltz seemed to last forever, and no time at all. Frederick guiding Eleanor through the steps with an easy grace that belied the tension she could feel humming beneath his composed exterior. And when the music finally ended, he did not release her immediately, but stood holding her hand in the center of the dance floor, while society watched and whispered and wondered what the Duke of Ravenscroft could possibly see in this disgraced woman who had somehow captured his name. They were separated briefly when Lord and Lady Ashworth approached to offer congratulations that dripped with false warmth, and Eleanor endured their scrutiny with the serene smile Clara had helped her practice, though inside she catalogued every barbed comment and backhanded compliment for later examination when she could afford to let her composure crack. Frederick appeared at her side within moments, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks, and together they navigated the treacherous waters of polite conversation with couples who barely concealed their curiosity about the scandalous match that had set London tongues wagging since the announcement appeared in the papers. It was near midnight when the confrontation Eleanor had been dreading finally materialized, Lady Thornhill cornering her near the refreshment table, while Frederick was detained by a group of gentlemen discussing some parliamentary matter, and the older woman's eyes glittered with malice as she spoke in a carrying whisper designed to reach the ears of everyone nearby. She remarked on how quickly Eleanor had traded one Thornhill for a duke, suggested that perhaps her son had been wise to see through such obvious social climbing, and asked with poisonous sweetness whether Eleanor had employed the same methods to trap Ravenscroft that she had used in her failed attempt to secure Marcus. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as nearby guests fell silent to witness her humiliation. But before she could formulate a response, a familiar voice cut through the whispers like a blade, and she turned to find Frederick standing behind her with an expression of such cold fury that Lady Thornhill actually stepped backward. He addressed the dowager with icy precision, noting that her son had been a cheat, a liar, and a coward who preyed upon innocent women, and that if she wished to discuss predatory behavior, perhaps she should examine her own family's legacy before casting aspersions upon his wife. The silence that followed was absolute, every eye in the ballroom fixed upon the tableau, and then Frederick took Eleanor's hand and raised it to his lips in full view of assembled society before announcing that they would be taking their leave as he found the company had grown tedious. As they swept toward the exit, Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, years of shame and self-doubt crumbling beneath the weight of his public declaration. And when they reached the carriage, she turned to him with tears streaming down her face, and told him that no one had ever defended her like that, had ever thought her worth defending at all. Frederick cupped her face in his hands and told her she was worth everything, and then his lips met hers in a kiss that rewrote every assumption Eleanor had ever made about what her life could become. The carriage ride back to Ravenscroft Hall passed in a blur of sensation and whispered words, Frederick holding Eleanor against his side, with one arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, while the other hand traced gentle patterns on her palm, and she found herself telling him things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Clara, secrets about her childhood and her parents, and the dreams she had once harbored before Marcus Thornhill had taught her that dreams were dangerous things that left you broken when they shattered. Frederick listened without interruption, his thumb moving steadily across her knuckles, and when she finally fell silent, he told her about Georgiana, about how his younger sister had been just 17 when Marcus had courted her with the same false promises he would later use on Eleanor, how she had believed herself loved and had nearly eloped before Frederick discovered the truth and intervened, how Marcus had spread vicious rumors about her virtue when she refused to continue the affair, how Georgiana had retreated to their aunt's estate in Scotland and had not returned to society in the 5 years since. Eleanor understood then why Frederick had reacted as he had when she first spoke Marcus's name in his library, understood the depth of rage that had nothing to do with business dealings and everything to do with watching someone you loved be destroyed by a man who viewed women as conquests to be discarded, and she reached up to touch his face in the darkness of the carriage, feeling the tension in his jaw beneath her fingertips as she told him she was sorry for what his sister had suffered. When they arrived home it was past 2 in the morning, but neither seemed willing to separate, and Frederick walked Eleanor to her chamber door, where they stood in the flickering light of a single candle while something unspoken trembled in the air between them. He asked if he might come in. Not for that, he added quickly, but simply because he was not ready to say good night, and Eleanor opened the door without hesitation and led him into the room where a fire still burned low and the moonlight streamed through windows she had forgotten to curtain. They sat together on the small settee before the hearth, Eleanor's head finding its way to Frederick's shoulder as exhaustion and emotion finally caught up with her, and he told her that watching her face Lady Thornhill's cruelty with such grace had changed something in him, had made him realize that his admiration for her had grown into something far more significant than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. Eleanor lifted her head to look at him, searching his grey eyes for any sign of deception, and finding only a vulnerability that matched her own, and she told him that she had not expected kindness when she came to his door all those weeks ago, had not dared to hope for respect or protection, and had never in her most desperate imaginings conceived that she might find herself falling in love with the man she had once feared above all others. The word hung between them like a held breath, and then Frederick was kissing her again, slow and deep and full of promise, and Eleanor kissed him back with all the hope she had, thought lost forever, finally believing that this unexpected life might become something beautiful after all. The days that followed the ball unfolded like pages of a story Eleanor had never dared to write for herself, each morning bringing new evidence that the life she was building with Frederick might be real after all, and she found herself watching him across the breakfast table with something that felt dangerously close to joy as he read aloud amusing passages from the morning papers and asked her opinion on matters both trivial and significant. Lady Harriet departed for her own estate with an embrace that startled Eleanor with its warmth, the older woman pressing a kiss to her cheek and murmuring that she had been wrong to doubt her son's judgment, and Clara remained for another week, her presence a comfort, as Eleanor navigated the complexities of her new position with growing confidence. Frederick had begun joining Eleanor for her afternoon walks in the garden, offering his arm as they strolled through the awakening grounds where crocuses pushed through the dark earth and the first daffodils nodded in the spring breeze. And during these walks, they spoke of everything and nothing, building the foundation of understanding that their unusual beginning had denied them. Eleanor was approximately 16 weeks along now, her condition becoming visible enough that the household staff had begun treating her with particular solicitude, and she often caught Frederick's gaze dropping to the gentle swell beneath her empire waist-gown, with an expression she could not quite decipher, but which no longer frightened her. One afternoon in early April, as they sat together in the library where they had first met under such different circumstances, Frederick set aside his book and turned to Eleanor with an intensity that made her breath catch, and he told her that he had written to Georgiana, had told his sister everything about Eleanor and the marriage and the child, and that Georgiana had written back expressing a wish to meet the woman who had somehow thawed their famously cold brother. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this evidence of acceptance she had not dared to hope for, and when she tried to thank Frederick, he shook his head and said that it was he who should thank her for showing him that the walls he had built around his heart were not protection but prison, and that she had somehow found the key he had thought long lost. That evening, as they dined alone for the first time since Clara's departure, Eleanor found herself reaching across the table to take Frederick's hand. And the way his fingers immediately interlaced with hers, the way his grey eyes softened as he looked at her, told her that whatever had begun between them as strategy had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated, but both had come to treasure. When he walked her to her chamber door that night, Frederick paused with his hand on the frame and asked if he might stay, not pressing but simply offering, and Eleanor answered by rising on her toes to press her lips to his in a kiss that held all the words she was not yet brave enough to speak aloud, then drawing him gently across the threshold into the candle-lit room where the fire burned warm and the bed waited with its promises of a new beginning built not on the ashes of her past, but on the unexpected gift of genuine love. The morning after their first night together dawned soft and golden, April sunlight streaming through the windows of Eleanor's chamber, where she lay nestled against Frederick's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear and marveling at how completely her world had transformed in the space of a single evening. She had expected awkwardness or regret when consciousness returned, had braced herself for the cold distance she remembered from Marcus's morning afters, when he would rise and dress without looking at her as though the intimacy of the night had been something shameful to be forgotten. But Frederick simply tightened his arm around her shoulders and pressed a kiss to her hair and asked if she had slept well with such genuine tenderness that she felt tears prick her eyes for the 100th time since coming to Ravenscroft Hall. They breakfasted together in her sitting room, Frederick in his shirt-sleeves and Eleanor wrapped in her dressing-gown, and the domesticity of it struck her as more intimate somehow than what had passed between them in the darkness, this quiet sharing of morning tea and toast feeling like a promise of countless mornings to come. Frederick told her that he had been thinking about the nursery, that the rooms traditionally used for Sinclair heirs were in the north wing, but that he wondered if she might prefer chambers closer to their own apartments, and the casual way he spoke of their child, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, made Eleanor reach across the table to take his hand. She told him that she had something to confess, and watched the flicker of concern cross his features before explaining that she had been afraid to believe this was real, had spent weeks waiting for him to reveal that his kindness was merely a longer game of the revenge he had initially claimed, and that she finally understood she had been doing him a disservice by measuring him against a man who had never deserved her trust in the first place. Frederick rose from his chair and came around the table to kneel beside her, taking both her hands in his and looking up at her with those grey eyes that had once seemed so cold and now held warmth she could hardly bear, and he told her that he had his own confession to make. He said that when he had first offered her his name, he had told himself it was about defeating Marcus even in death, about claiming the ultimate victory over a man who had taken so much from his family, but that somewhere in the weeks since he had stopped thinking of Marcus entirely, had stopped caring about revenge or vindication or any of the bitter motivations that had governed his life for so long. He told her that she had become the only thing that mattered, she and the child she carried, and that he did not care whose blood ran in that baby's veins, because it would be raised with his love and his name and his protection, and it would never know a moment of doubt about its place in the world. Eleanor bent to kiss him then, tasting salt on her lips and unsure whether the tears were hers or his, and when they finally drew apart, she told him she loved him, the words coming easily now, and his smile as he said them back was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Eleanor had never imagined possible, her days filled with the quiet pleasures of a life built on genuine affection rather than the desperate survival that had defined her existence for so long, and she found herself waking each morning with Frederick's arm draped across her waist and his breath warm against her neck, marveling that this man who had once seemed carved from ice now reached for her even in sleep, as though afraid she might disappear. April advanced into May, and with it the gardens of Ravenscroft Hall burst into spectacular bloom, the roses climbing the south wall opening their crimson hearts to the warming sun, while Eleanor's own body blossomed with the child growing stronger within her, now at 20 weeks unmistakably visible beneath her empire waist-gowns, and she often caught Frederick watching her with an expression of such tender wonder that she had to look away lest she weep from the sheer improbability of her happiness. Georgiana arrived in mid-May, Frederick's younger sister proving to be nothing like Eleanor had feared. Not bitter or suspicious, but warm and wounded in equal measure, a young woman of 22 who had survived her own brush with Marcus Thornhill's cruelty, and emerged with scars that Eleanor recognized all too well, and within days of her arrival, the two women had formed a bond that transcended their shared history of pain to become something like sisterhood. Frederick observed their growing friendship with visible relief, confessing to Eleanor one evening that he had worried Georgiana would see in her a reminder of everything Marcus had taken, but instead his sister seemed to find in Eleanor a kindred spirit who understood without requiring explanation, and this gift of companionship for his beloved sister only deepened his love for the wife he had never expected to find. The household had transformed around them, Mrs. Fleming's quiet efficiency now warmed by genuine affection for her new mistress, the footmen and maids treating Eleanor with respect that had nothing to do with her title and everything to do with the kindness she showed them, and even Lady Harriet's letters from her country estate had shifted from cautious approval to something approaching maternal warmth. Philip Greville visited regularly, no longer questioning Frederick's judgment, but instead marveling openly at the change in his friend, telling Eleanor during one afternoon tea that he had known Frederick for 15 years and never once seen him laugh the way he laughed now, free and full and frequent, as though some burden he had carried since youth had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The baby moved constantly now, kicks and flutters that Eleanor guided Frederick's hand to feel each night as they lay together, and she watched his face each time the child stirred beneath his palm, searching for any sign that he remembered this baby was not his blood, and finding only pure, uncomplicated love, the same love she saw when he looked at her, the same love she felt swelling in her own chest until she thought it might burst from the sheer, overwhelming weight of gratitude and joy and hope for the future they were building together stone by precious stone.